What can we learn about leadership from a British king? Welcome to Leadership and Legacy, Conversations at the George Washington Presidential Library at Mount Vernon. I'm Dr. Lindsay Chervinsky, director of the library. In this podcast series, we talk with experts about leadership and history, how studying these stories helps us understand our current moment, and how we can apply lessons from leaders in the past to our own lives. Sally Bedell Smith is the New York Times bestselling author of 8 biographies. Her latest, George VI and Elizabeth, The Marriage That Saved the Monarchy, is the definitive biography of the late Queen Elizabeth II's mother and father, based for the first time on special access to their letters and diaries in the Royal Archives at Windsor Castle that was granted to the author by the Queen. Ms. Smith has also written best-selling biographies of King Charles III, Queen Elizabeth II, Diana, Princess of Wales, John and Jacqueline Kennedy, Bill and Hillary Clinton, Pamela Harriman, and William S. Paley. She is the go-to person for royal commentary and has won awards for her work, including the Washington Irving Medal for Literary Excellence. I was eager to record with Sally because her expertise is so different than my own. I also think that most Americans don't really think about the modern monarchy and leadership. We tend to see it as a figurehead or ceremonial part of the British system. So I knew that I would learn a lot from Sally, and I think you will too. Now for my conversation with Sally Bedell Smith. Well, Sally, thank you so much for joining us. I'm so excited about this conversation because I think we have really neglected the Anglican side of leadership. And so this is a wonderful opportunity. You have written so many wonderful books that have received so much acclaim. How do you pick your subjects?
Well, it's sort of been by choice and circumstance. I've written 8 biographies, and the first one was about William Paley, who was the founder of CBS. And I had been writing about the broadcasting business for the New York Times, and he was the sort of titan. I wanted to take a deep dive. So I wrote the book about him. And while I was doing that, I discovered that in World War II, he had an affair with Winston Churchill's daughter-in-law, Pamela.
Oh my gosh.
And I dug in a little bit more and found out that she had had an extraordinary life, really, 6 lives, as sort of the most famous courtesan of the 20th century, who then became a political power broker in Democratic politics in Washington after she married Averell Harriman, who was a financier and diplomat. Both those books took me 5 years apiece, and I was doing my archives the other day, going through my archives, and I discovered I did 1,300 interviews for the Pamela Harriman book with over 500 people. So it was a deep, deep dive. And this was the circumstance. Those were both by choice. And Princess Diana died in August of 1997. Random House asked me if I would do her biography.
Oh, wow.
The challenge there was I had to do it in 18 months.
Oh, my goodness.
I was accustomed to a more leisurely pace.
Yeah.
And so I did that. And then Random House said, well, why don't you do a biography of Jack and Jackie Kennedy in the White House? And so I did that. It was called Grace and Power. Random House then said, would you do a biography of Bill and Hillary Clinton in the White House? So I did that. And then, really to my delight, they asked me to write a biography of Queen Elizabeth II.
Oh, wow.
That would be timed for her Diamond Jubilee in 2012. And so I happily did that. And then I decided the next one, which would be her successor. And I wrote a biography of Prince Charles that came out in 2017. After that, I decided, well, maybe I should do the origin story of this British royal family, or at least the current one. And so I wrote a book about Charles's grandparents, Queen Elizabeth's parents, George VI and Elizabeth. And that makes 8.
Well, that is quite a trajectory. And I am so glad you did, because it's really fun to be able to talk about George VI. That's going to be our main subject today. Some quick background. George VI was the father of Queen Elizabeth II and the grandfather of the current monarch, Charles III. He saw the country through World War II. He was never supposed to be king, but was thrust into the position after his older brother, Edward VIII, famously abdicated to marry the American Wallis Simpson. We'll dig into all of this during our conversation. From a writer's perspective, I'm really curious, what was the difference for you in the books, or I guess I should say, was there a difference in the subjects that you selected yourself and those that they asked you to do?
There really wasn't.
That's an amazing skill that you can say that, though.
I was enthusiastic about all of them. People often ask me what was my favorite, and it's like asking your favorite child. I loved each of them as I was doing them.
Did they ever suggest an idea that you said no to?
Yes. My editor at Simon & Schuster, I did my first couple of books there, and then I went to Random House. But at one point, she suggested that I do J. Edgar Hoover because she thought it would be a portrait in power.
Mm-hmm.
Well, there was a man by the name of, I think, Kurt Gentry, who wrote this massive biography of Hoover, which I dutifully read.
Yeah.
And the more I read, the more I disliked him.
Oh, no.
And so I think you have to, you can't necessarily be in love with your biographical subject, although it helps if you admire and respect them. But I said no. I wouldn't do that. And then, of course, a couple of years ago, somebody wrote a biography of Hoover that won the Pulitzer Prize. So, oh well.
Yes. Well, it's a good point because I think, you either have to admire or respect, or there has to be something that fascinates you about them. And Beverly Gage, who wrote that book about Hoover, I don't get the sense that she liked him, but she certainly was fascinated. Yeah. So there has to be some sort of a hook there. So King George VI, I think a lot of people maybe are familiar with him loosely through perhaps some movies. The King's Speech is a great example, but that really takes on his life once he becomes king. Yes. So let's do a little bit of background for those who aren't familiar with his story. What was his life before he was King George VI?
Well, he was born at the end of the Victorian era in 1895. He was the son of the future King George V and Queen Mary. And his older brother was Prince Edward, who was the heir to the throne. And he was the charming and outgoing and quite pampered heir. Prince Albert, which was the future George VI's name, was known as Bertie. He was shy. And at the age of 8, as people from the King's Speech know, he acquired a really crippling stutter, but he sort of managed somehow. And when he was 24 years old, his father made him the Duke of York, and he called it a splendid old title. And he said, "I know you will do nothing to tarnish this great title," which sort of reminds us of what happened only a couple of weeks ago when King Charles stripped his brother of that title. And I think it's good to remember that it was a venerable title and was no small thing to have really cast a shadow on it.
Well, so let's actually talk a little bit about that title, because I think a lot of Americans don't really understand how that works. Why was that title so important, and why was it venerable?
Well, it was old, and it was traditionally given to the second son, which Bertie was. And I have to say, he really distinguished himself with that title. He dedicated himself really to improving the lives of factory workers and miners, and to the extent that he was called the Industrial King. And I always felt that his work in that capacity gave him a sort of connection to ordinary people and gave him also exposure to people all across the political spectrum. And that in turn, I think, helped him. He never knew this, but it was a sort of democratizing experience that would later make him a better monarch. But I should mention, of course, that he met and then married the Scottish aristocrat, Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, and they led a pretty low-key life, carrying out their duties and earning really the respect and admiration of the British people for being so dutiful. While Prince Edward, the Playboy prince, was childless, not married. Bertie and Elizabeth went on to have 2 daughters, Princess Elizabeth, who became known in the family as Lilibet, and Princess Margaret.
So he is the Duke of York. He is married. He has a family. How does he go from being the Duke of York to the king?
Well, it's a dramatic story. In January of 1936, King George V died. Edward became King Edward VIII. And when I was reading the documents in the Royal Archives, I've spent about 3 months there in Windsor Castle, in that big round tower on the top. I realized what a irresponsible and really dangerous king Edward VIII was. Among other things, he was very pro-Nazi at a time when Hitler was building up his resources to wage war on England and the continent. And so he was not going to be a good king in the long run. But what created a constitutional crisis was when he fell in love with the twice divorced Wallis Simpson, an American, and he declared that he wanted to marry her and make her his queen. And the British government and the Church of England said that simply could not happen. And so on December 11th, 1936, he abdicated and his younger brother became king. And I think probably in part because of his stutter, a lot of people sort of underestimated him. But he had, again, as people who watched the King's Speech knew, he had worked really diligently to master that stutter and become a pretty effective public speaker. And he had those experiences as the Duke of York that had prepared him for the role that he assumed.
There are a couple of threads I want to pull on there. So the British government and the Church of England said that King Edward could not marry Wallis Simpson. How come? I mean, that obviously feels foreign to us today when people get divorced somewhat quickly. So why was that their answer?
Those were the rules. They were the government rules. They were the Church of England rules. And the Church of England had, it took a long time for them to modify them to the extent that they would even recognize divorce. And for a king, it was just a non-starter.
Well, I think also most Americans might not know, unless they come from an Anglican tradition, that the king is technically the head of the Church of England. So to break the rules of the church that you're supposed to be in charge of is a little bit hypocritical, doesn't go quite far enough.
The monarch is the supreme governor of the Church of England. And so those two factors were entwined.
Okay, so King George, what was the Duke of York, Albert, now becomes King George VI. Why did he pick the name George?
To honor his father.
Oh, that's lovely.
He could have become King Albert, which was his first name, but in their tradition, they all have multiple names that they can choose from. And I think there was a feeling that Albert, even though it honored Queen Victoria's husband, that it was perhaps a little too Germanic. But I think it was mainly to honor his father and to show that there was some continuity.
Well, and that was particularly important because of what he would face next. But one more question to sort of lay the groundwork. If people are big fans of, let's say, Tudor history, or if they've watched Wolf Hall or any of these things, they might have a certain conception of what the British monarchy looked like. And that is very much not the same monarchy that we saw in the 20th century. So what were the responsibilities? What were the powers of the crown? What did that role entail at that time when he took it over?
Well, it had changed mainly in the 19th century under Queen Victoria, from an executive monarchy to a constitutional system in which the parliament had the power and the monarch acted on the advice of the government. When George VI became king, the system was in place that, as Walter Bagehot, who is the great constitutional scholar, said, that the monarch's role was not to give advice, but to be consulted to encourage and to warn. And the monarch really has two roles. As the head of state, the monarch is responsible for representing Britain at home and overseas. And as the head of nation, the monarch really is the sort of glue that binds the country together. She represents continuity and tradition and stability. And as part of that, something that people don't really give enough credit to, the monarch recognizes service by the British people. We saw yesterday David Beckham getting knighted, and there was much of it to do about it. He said it was the most exciting day of his life. But the monarch recognizes people from all walks of life, very humble people. And I think it's a really important thing that often isn't recognized enough. And one other thing that was described to me by one of the Queen's advisors, and I love the way he said it, that the monarch is the sheet in the middle that people can hang on to in times of turbulence. And that has proved the case over and over.
It's such an important point because, in our political system, as I see it, one of the challenges is the president today has become, they actually have three roles. So they are the head of state. They are doing the diplomacy that we expect the king and queen to do. They are doing the head of nation. So in moments of crisis, they are expected to be the consoler in chief or to manage a crisis response. But they're also the head of party. And those three things are often quite incompatible. And in some ways, while I'm sure this is extremely sacrilegious to say this sitting at Mount Vernon, the home of George Washington, it does make sense to separate them because I think it's often asking too much for a partisan figure to also be head of state and head of nation.
Well, the one thing I omitted is that as part of being a monarch in the 20th century, there was an English philosopher who put this very well, that the monarch has to be the light above politics. And that means that they really have to remove themselves from politics. Not that they're not aware of it, but that they can't be part of it. And I think that's a real strength of the British monarch.
Experience leadership like never before at the George Washington Leadership Institute. Inspired by the timeless lessons of George Washington, our programs focus on critical skills like effective communication, emotional intelligence, adaptability, strategic vision, and character-driven leadership. Immerse your team in a journey through history while equipping them with strategies to navigate today's complex challenges. Join us at the beautiful George Washington Presidential Library at Mount Vernon for a half-day or full-day sessions, or customize a program to fit your needs. Visit gwleadershipinstitute.org to learn more.
So you mentioned that public speaking, George VI's ability to sort of master public speaking was really important. Why was public speaking such an important part of his role, first sort of as Duke of York, but then also as king?
Well, I think it was really important in World War II, and we can get into that because he reigned for 15 years, and 6 of those years were during the war. He was obligated to make speeches, and in the 2 years, or the several years before the war, he and his wife exercised what we now call soft power. And they went to France, and as a gesture of Anglo-French solidarity, as Hitler was getting ready to wage war on Britain and Europe. Even more importantly, in 1939, they came to the United States, and this was an opportunity for them to really shore up the special relationship. No monarch had ever been to the United States.
Wow.
And they were received rapturously by hundreds of thousands of people in Washington and New York. And behind the scenes, and all these trips are on the advice of government. That's the other part of being a monarch. George VI and Franklin Roosevelt had a series of meetings in which they really laid the groundwork for some very important measures that were taken in the first years of World War II that helped save Britain until the United States could come in December of 1941.
That's really interesting because I think so often people credit Churchill for doing those things, which of course he played a role and was very close with FDR and was an important leader in his own right. But I don't think most people know the King's role.
Yeah, he had a very important role, and he had actually been in a kind of secret correspondence with FDR even before he got there. And they continued to correspond. And in the middle of the war, because he couldn't travel, but he did travel at various times, but he couldn't travel to the UK. And Eleanor came as his representative. There was a real mutual admiration and respect. After those meetings, which occurred first in the White House and then up at Hyde Park, where they famously ate hot dogs, but George VI wrote it all down, and he, of course, transmitted a copy to the government, but he kept it with him for the entire war in one of his dispatch boxes.
Wow. That's so meaningful that he kept it. That's such a telling small anecdote about what that relationship meant. So you talked about the soft power of these visits and of the importance of travel. What were some of the other duties and the other elements of leadership during World War II that we should know about?
Well, they really rose to greatness. When the war began, they were very busy going around visiting factories, visiting troops. And then, starting in August of 1940, they faced waves of bombings from the Germans. And they began to travel all over Britain, consoling the victims and bearing witness to the destruction. They went over and over again to the poorest parts of London and were just there for the British people. Buckingham Palace was bombed 9 times.
Wow.
The second bombing was a direct hit that nearly killed the king and queen.
Oh my gosh.
It came very close. Afterwards, he issued a statement saying, "We have now experienced German barbarity, and it is only spurring us on and should spur everybody else on to fight to the end and to be victorious." So that was a huge morale booster. That was an important part of their roles. The Queen famously said after that we can now look the East End in the face because nobody was immune from being bombed.
That's such an important point because, I think so often today at least, we sort of see the royal family as a part, and certainly they could have left. They could have gone somewhere else. They could have gone to safety, but by staying and experiencing what other people experience, and we see this, with leaders across the centuries, by putting themselves either in harm's way or sacrificing the same way that sort of everyone else has to sacrifice, it is a real demonstration of sort of shared solidarity.
Absolutely. It really was. It was a crucial part of their leadership.
So you mentioned earlier that he married Elizabeth. Can you tell us a little bit, and then of course you just quoted her there, what was their marriage like? What did it contribute to his leadership? We always want to emphasize those that maybe don't actually have the original crown, but are a very important part of the story. On this series, we have often discussed the role of first ladies and how they have been able to take on leadership roles alongside their husbands. So I naturally wanted to know, what was it like for Queen Elizabeth, George VI's wife?
Well, they had a wonderful marriage, and he often said that he confided everything in her. She knew about the tube alloy project, which was the development of the atomic bomb. She knew everything. She was so trusted when Churchill came to Buckingham Palace for his Tuesday audience with the king over lunch, a buffet. They served themselves, and she was usually there.
Wow.
And Churchill really trusted her as well. So
That's
it was
incredible.
a really strong partnership.
Is that unusual? I mean, do we usually see love matches and partnerships like that in the monarchy?
Well, I think we saw it with Queen Elizabeth II and Philip. With George V and Queen Mary, he didn't really confide much in her. Certainly was not the case with Edward VII and Queen Alexandra. Queen Victoria and Albert were a whole other combination, because he actually, for many years, functioned as her private secretary. He had extraordinary power. But Queen Elizabeth was just an equal partner with him, and there was a real relationship of mutual trust, and he relied on her judgment.
That's so important to have someone like that who knows everything, that you can trust, and you can trust to give you good advice, because sometimes the advice is not always good advice. So we know that all leaders, regardless of who they are, they have their biggest successes and their biggest failures. So what were some of George's successes and failures?
Well, I think his successes were cumulatively his ability to inspire and to reassure the British public. And it was really in combination with Churchill that they were able to do that. I was thinking about his failures, and I can think of two. One, as head of state, occurred during the Munich crisis in the fall of 1938. And Neville Chamberlain was desperately trying to prevent a war. He traveled to Germany, I think, 4 times, and at the end of it, signed a German-American friendship agreement. He agreed to give away a huge chunk of Czechoslovakia, and in return, Hitler reassured him that he had no further territorial ambitions. Chamberlain returned to Britain, waving a piece of paper and saying, "This is peace for our time." George VI invited him onto the Buckingham Palace balcony, where they stood for 4 minutes, and Chamberlain received all these ovations. And that really went beyond the monarch's role to be politically impartial. It showed that he approved of a policy that was, in fact, quite controversial. And many years later, Queen Elizabeth and the Queen Mother said that it was a constitutional error.
Oh, wow.
And the other example was a personal one that happened after the abdication, when George VI denied Wallis, the Duchess of Windsor, the title of Her Royal Highness. And he did it in concert with Elizabeth and with his mother, Queen Mary, because they thought she was unfit to have that. But it did actually go against precedent and law, because the spouse of somebody like a duke who had an HRH, which he had, was supposed to be his equal. And so this put her in a subordinate position. It made them furious. And really, for the rest of his life, he campaigned with his brother and anybody else who would listen to have that reversed. It caused a huge rift that never healed.
I appreciate very much the inclusion of public and personal failures, because for leaders like the king, and I would say for presidents too, they're so often hand in hand. So many of our listeners know about how presidents learn about leadership, but how do kings? Was he interested in history? There isn't really a school on how to be a king. So what were the influences on his leadership? Monarchs, unlike presidents, know almost from birth that they will have an important role to play in their country's politics. Even though George VI was not originally supposed to succeed his father, I wanted to know how this impacted his education around leadership and later the education of his daughter Elizabeth.
Well, I think you have to remember, first of all, that he was second in line, and he was not specifically trained to be king. But there was something that happened during World War I that I think was very important. In 1914, he came down with a very serious stomach ailment that made him leave the Royal Navy periodically. Wow. At one point, he went to London. Winston Churchill was the first Lord of the Admiralty, and he went to work for him on his staff. And he had an opportunity over a couple of months to watch Churchill at work. And he was admitted into the secret war room. So this was just a kind of an experience that he didn't know at the time, but would be important. And then the following year, his father had a terrible accident on horseback in 1915. And this is when the Duke of York was still very sick. And so they sort of convalesced together. That gave Bertie an opportunity to talk to his father about politics and to review the battle reports and all the things that a monarch would do during wartime. And these were lessons, again, that he didn't really realize at the time, but they gave him some insight into how a monarch operates during the war that he was able to apply later.
So that relationship that he developed with Churchill, that must have really paid dividends when they were, in some ways, their positions were kind of reversed with World War II. But did it lay a foundation for a close relationship?
I'm not sure it did, because in the interval, we had the abdication.
Oh, yes.
And initially, Churchill was on the wrong side. It wasn't so much because he was fond of Edward VIII. It was because he so revered the position of the monarchy that he didn't want to do anything that would disturb it. And so that was sort of in the air. Although George VI was a pretty tolerant man and he recognized Churchill's talents. And when the time came for Churchill to become prime minister, they really had a very, very close relationship. But I think it didn't really have. It helped that he had seen him in action, that he knew him over the years. They went hunting together and shooting together. But it really was when they were thrown together during World War II. And it took a little while. In his diaries, he said, Churchill really isn't opening up to me. But eventually it became an extraordinary partnership.
That's amazing. So I'd like to talk about his very famous daughter. So Queen Elizabeth II was the longest reigning monarch in British history. Is that right?
Yes, 70 years.
Oh, good. Glad I got that right. That would be a very embarrassing fact to get wrong. Was he attentive to trying to make sure he helped her learn, since he hadn't really had that kind of schooling because he hadn't expected to be monarch? Or did she learn from him? What did that look like?
I think it was all of the above. She was 10 years old when he became king, and that was the moment when she realized she would eventually become queen. They were very good about exposing her to public situations and helping her develop poise and just an awareness of what she was facing. I was so struck, again, this was from his diary, that when she was 12 years old, she went to a luncheon in Buckingham Palace with all these officials. It was a luncheon for the Polish foreign minister only months before the war began. When she was 13, her parents hired a tutor to teach her about constitutional principles and history, and it was a very rigorous curriculum. At the age of 14, she gave her first radio address.
Wow.
And she was a diligent reader of the Times and listener to the BBC. And one of her father's advisors said she had a very finely attuned, something to the effect she had a very finely attuned sense for politics and public affairs, as early as 17.
Wow.
So she was really very mature, but it was her learning crucible, as it were, was during World War II. And her parents were very good about taking her out and showing her soldiers and airmen, and she had a lot of responsibilities. And then, of course, toward the end of the war, she was trained as a mechanic for about 3 weeks. But they wanted to really prepare her. It was very conscious. Her mother did things like she had her do role-playing exercises because she was really quite shy. So her mother would pretend to be the Archbishop of Canterbury and encourage her to learn how to talk. But George VI brought her along. She observed his qualities in action. She observed his perseverance, his conscientiousness, his duty, obviously. She later said that what impressed her most was his steadfastness. And as she got older, he did introduce her to the documents that she was going to have to read and absorb when she became queen. This was what I discovered from reading his diaries, which began on September 3rd, 1939, the first day of World War II. And I think, like many people, I had underestimated him. But those diaries revealed that he was very opinionated. He was often very wise. He was far-sighted. And he was even thinking about post-war planning as early as November 1939. And so it was a real revelation. And if you'd like,
yes,
I can
please.
read you just one day that showed the range of what he would do.
Absolutely.
This was Friday, October 11th, 1940. We went to visit 3 communal feeding centers in South London to feed those people who have their houses, but no gas, electricity, or water with which to cook or wash. They get a hot meal a day, and a very good one, too. And the people we talked to were very grateful for what is being done for them. He then had an audience at Buckingham Palace with Joseph Kennedy, who was retiring as the American ambassador. George VI took a dim view of him.
That was very wise on his part.
Here's partly because he was an appeaser. Here's what he said about Kennedy that day. He is always the shrewd, hard businessman and still thinks in terms of dollars as against the terms of human feelings. We are fighting for our lives and homes now, and if our houses are destroyed by Nazi bombing, we are still alive, and that is all that matters. Money and material things are of no account in relation to life. The others can be replaced, but not life. Then he met, and this was really quite moving, he met with Sir Hugh Dowding, who was the Air Chief Marshal and head of the RAF Fighter Command. He would later be credited with winning the Battle of Britain, but that day he was depressed. And George VI wrote, as C&C, no one has had more responsibility or hard work in these last few years, working on the AI, that meant airborne interception with radar systems, both for aircraft and searchlights, unceasingly now, and he nearly wept when he told me how much he loathed seeing the results of German night bombing in London. I sympathized with him and told him not to worry, as I felt sure that his dream would become a reality very soon, and it will too, as it is very nearly perfected. Science is always very slow in its methods. A man has to suffer many disappointments in its cause. And there's so many things that those passages show. It showed this wisdom, it showed this prescience, and that was who he was. He was far more impressive than I think a lot of people have given him credit for.
Yeah, that's incredible. So what did Queen Elizabeth II replicate from his example, or were there things that she intentionally did differently?
I think in a lot of ways she did follow his lead. He had tutored her so closely. She was certainly every bit as conscientious as he was. She read her Daily Dispatch boxes wherever she was, every day of the year except Christmas and Easter. And there was a good example. 4 months before he died, she and Philip went on their first overseas tour. They went to Canada for 35 days. They did 70 engagements. And then they went to the United States and they were the guests of Harry Truman in Washington. But that was the sort of general playbook, very well orchestrated. She did that throughout her reign. And there were, obviously he only reigned for 15 years. She reigned for 70 years. He faced all those challenges of wartime, which she never had. But she did have different kinds of challenges. And the one that came to mind the most when I was thinking about it was what happened when Diana died. And for the first time, the Queen felt anger and even hatred. And what was impressive about it is the way she responded very quickly. And she pivoted in a way. She came to London sooner than she ordinarily would have. She knew the people were angry at her for seeming to be insensitive to their grief. She did a live television broadcast that people probably remember. And that was not something she was comfortable with. But she felt that she needed to do that. And then what was equally interesting was that in the aftermath, she realized that even though Diana had caused them a lot of problems. Tony Blair once compared her to a meteor that flew into a very calm ecosystem in the royal family. But there were things that the Queen recognized. The monarchy became less formal. She became more approachable when she was out on her engagements, and they engaged in a kind of incremental attentiveness to change. They didn't want to do anything dramatic because they didn't want to unduly alarm people. And, even as they were making adjustments, they wanted to make sure people knew that the monarchy was solid.
I think all the time of the example when the Obamas visited and ended up breaking protocol by basically touching the Queen in photos. And I think that maybe a previous version of her would not have been so warm in response.
It was a very funny scene because I talked to two of the people who were there, and what they were doing was they were comparing their heights.
That's so funny.
And looking at their shoes. And so it was a sort of natural thing. They sort of put their arms around each other.
That's amazing.
But everybody misinterpreted it.
Yes.
Thought Michelle Obama was out of line, but the Queen was perfectly fine with that. But you're right, because there was another image that comes to mind, which happened when the Queen and Prince Philip were in Washington visiting Bush 41. And they went out to a housing project, and they met a woman who looked at the Queen, and she immediately threw her arms around the Queen. And the Queen just sort of stood there with her arms at her side because she didn't know quite what to do.
Yeah.
But that changed.
Yes.
She never became particularly huggy, but she was much more approachable.
Definitely. So our two final standard questions. What is one book that really taught you something about leadership or that you learned a lot from?
Well, as you can probably tell, I do think that Winston Churchill was the greatest leader of the 20th century, and obviously read a lot about him. And I think that the book that taught me the most about his leadership was Andrew Roberts' biography that came out in 2018, Churchill Walking with Destiny. And as a biographer, I just really appreciated the perceptive analysis that he did of Churchill's character, including his flaws. He could be overbearing, but he really knitted together. It was just the skill with which he did it, I suppose, impressed me more than anything else. But he showed really why he was a superb leader, how courageous and sometimes even defiant he could be when he was faced with people who were vigorously opposing him. And I think that's a character trait of a strong leader, as long as what he believes in is the right move. And he also had many examples of what I think was Churchill's greatest talent, which was his ability to use the English language to inspire people and move them out of their complacency.
Well, that is a great example. And as biographers go, not many are more skilled than Andrew Roberts. So an excellent suggestion. All right, our typical last final question. When you think of George Washington and leadership, what comes to mind?
Well, I think he was the absolutely essential man in those times. His goal was unity. All those brilliant men around him, had lots and lots of talents, but they also had agendas. And sometimes, a thought experiment is if you could reverse engineer colonial history, what would it have been like without Washington to lead the Continental Army and be president? I can't think of any of the others who could have fit that role. He had that ability, as you well know, to look over the horizon, to encourage people to compromise, and above all, to promote the unity of that very fragile republic. And of course, his farewell address was a masterclass in finishing up strong and stepping off the public stage gracefully, and then above all, emphasizing the need to keep the country together.
Well, that is very well said. We absolutely agree. Thank you so much for joining us. This has been such a delightful conversation. I've enjoyed it so much.
You're welcome. I have too, Lindsay.
Thank you for joining us this week on Leadership and Legacy. And thank you so much again to our guest, Sally Bedell Smith. You can find her most recent book, George VI and Elizabeth, The Marriage That Saved the Monarchy, wherever you like to buy books. I'm your host, Dr. Lindsay Travinsky. Leadership and Legacy, Conversations at the George Washington Presidential Library is a production of the Mount Vernon Ladies Association and Primary Source Media. In the spirit of George Washington's leadership, we feature the perspectives of leaders from across industries and fields. As such, the thoughts expressed in this podcast are solely the views of our guests and do not reflect the opinions of the Mount Vernon Ladies Association. To learn more about Washington's leadership example, or to find out how you can bring your team to the George Washington Presidential Library, visit gwleadershipinstitute.org. Or to find more great podcasts from Mount Vernon, visit georgewashingtonpodcast.com. You can also explore the work of Primary Source Media at primarysourcemedia.com. Join us in 2 weeks for our next great conversation.